Okay, this is episode 13 of Bible Basics. Last week we talked about Eusebius versus Ehrman, and I'm going to continue on that subject because I ran out of time. I didn't realize it would take me as long as it was doing to tell you about that. But it's very important that you understand this because it's very important to understand who wrote the New Testament writings. We have a right to know, especially if people back then knew. In my mind, this is very much like trying to track the authorship of Aunt Millie's recipe for German chocolate cake. If I've told you that before, it bears repeating. When you want to know who really wrote the recipe for Aunt Millie's German chocolate cake, you got to figure out who are you going to ask, where are you going to go. I would think Aunt Millie's family would be the place you'd start, right? You don't want to go with people who don't even know who Aunt Millie was. Why would you ask them? Why would they have any reason to know? Well, who had the New Testament writings? The first churches. They're the ones that had the writings, and they passed them down from generation to generation, just like families hand down a recipe. And the starting point should be that not like, well, who in the world wrote this thing? It should be, it was probably Aunt Millie, don't you think? I mean, did Aunt Millie's family have a reason for pulling off this conspiracy? Was Uncle Elmer, like wanting to puff up his wife's reputation? I'm not saying that absolutely she had to write it, but if you want to investigate the subject, it is reasonable to say, well, do we have good reasons to believe it was somebody other than Aunt Millie? Now, I know this probably sounds foolish. This analogy sounds foolish, but that's what modern scholars are doing. They're saying, in effect, they're not literally saying this, but the logical inference of their position on the subject is they want to no, I can't. If you're saying Aunt Millie wrote it, I can't hear that. I can't. I've got to come at it unbiased, objective. We want to analyze this, see who wrote it. We can't necessarily trust Aunt Millie's family. Well, I'm not saying Aunt Millie's family is the greatest family in the world. I mean, maybe they got some shady characters in the family somewhere. I don't know. Maybe even they're gangsters. But even gangsters have to have they don't lie about everything. They just lie about things that'll get them in trouble. Why would they lie to you about a recipe for German chocolate cake or cannoli or whatever it is that they're talking about? Let me get this book back down. This is the book we were talking about, Forged by Bart Ehrman. Sold a lot of copies. Man's made a lot of money selling. Contrast that with people who wrote Old Testament. How many royalties you think they got? No. They didn't write for royalties. In fact, they paid to get to write. They didn't pay with money. They paid with their lives. They paid with their time. They paid with their reputations. And probably even paid with some money too. Parted with money. Spent their own money to get them going from place to place, to spread the gospel. I'm not saying it's a sin for a man to make money writing a book. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just trying to draw a distinction. Which man carries the greater valor? The one who wrote for money, or the man who gave his life to write? Just one's, I'm not saying either is worthy of disrespect, but one is definitely worthy of more respect than the other. And we need to keep our respect directed as it should be. So So modern scholars, and again, I'm not picking on Bart Ehrman. He just happens to be the face of modern scholarship to most people. And he's been a very successful author. But he, by his own admission, he'll say repeatedly, I suppose he has his own opinions on some things, but on the things that he really pushes really, really hard and that he has sold a lot of books on, it's things where he knows he's got the academy, the modern scholars in his corner, that they're going to back him up and say, yeah, that's what we've discovered. Those are our findings. And speaking of modern scholarship, I was thinking of another book here. This book is called The Soul of the American University. It was written about 20 years ago, I think, by an American historian, George Marsden. And, I mentioned that Bart Ehrman taught at the University of North Carolina. And that is, it's typical. He is typical for scholars at these institutions, not typical in his book publishing success, but certainly typical in terms of his opinions about who wrote the books of the New Testament. But let me read from the inner flap here of this book by George Marsden. Only a century ago, which would be the late 1800s, early 1900s, only a century ago, almost all state universities in America held compulsory chapel services. Not just held chapel services, held compulsory chapel services. And some required Sunday church attendance as well. He goes on to say, in fact, state-sponsored chapel services were commonplace until the World War II era and as late as the 1950s. It was not unusual for leading schools to refer to themselves as Christian institutions. You probably know that Harvard, Yale, Princeton were all started as schools to train ministers. They were religious Christian institutions, Protestant Christians. So they were very, very, very different from the secular scholarship we have today. And then Marsden goes on to say, today, the once pervasive influence of religion in the intellectual and cultural life of America's preeminent colleges and universities has all but vanished. So this goes to the dominance of modern biblical scholarship that I've been talking about the last few episodes, that they largely ignore the work of ancient scholars and church leaders who actually had custody of these documents. They actually had them. But all those manuscripts, they were handwritten manuscripts. Scholars today can't go back and interview who copied this manuscript. That's what they could do back here. I mean, when Eusebius was checking around the churches, he was talking to people, say, yeah, I remember my great grandpappy, he said this, and when they were going to church in Thessalonica, they were reading Paul's 2 letters there. And so, when someone came along and said, hey, we found a 3rd letter to the Thessalonians, there were real Thessalonians they could go check with to see, hey, was there 3 letters or 2? But modern scholars, no, they're not listening to these guys. Why? Because they had faith. They were religious people. You can't believe what they said. That is, well, it's prejudiced. It's dumb. That's like saying Americans can't write American history because they have a bias. Or Jews can't write about the Holocaust because they have a bias. Art lovers can't write about art because they have a bias. Yeah, ancient writers could have a bias. Modern writers can have a bias. In fact, modern biblical scholars, and as I've said, not all of them take this point of view. There are liberal and conservative. The dominant view, the controlling view, is the liberal view. So there's some who will go back and rely on the work of the ancients who actually had the recipes, had the earliest copies of the recipes, and ate the cake. That's important too. So, but by and large, these scholars are basically turning up their noses at people who had access to much more evidence. They could go find out, where'd you copy this manuscript from? Where'd you get it? And they could trace it. They could trace these things back. Now, we could wish that they had kept more records of all that. If they'd known we were going to have all these questions, they probably would have kept track of it. But it's just like when you write something at your house today. You don't put your name on every single piece of paper you write something on. Why? Because you know you wrote it, or your wife knows you wrote it, or you know what she wrote. You don't have to. You recognize each other's handwriting. You didn't have to write your name on everything. And and if you pass it on to your children, they know it came from you. So when these things get started, people aren't always anticipating the questions that generations, hundreds of years in advance will, or hundreds of years later will want to know. But this is the sad state we are. So you're really going to be forced to choose, just like I'm forced to choose between, modern scholars and ancient scholars. So let me review what we're talking, what's at stake here, or what we're asked to be based on. These modern scholars are 1,500 to 2,000 years removed from the scene. They're saying that why the Bible's authors are not who we think they are. That's like saying why Aunt Millie's recipe was not written by Aunt Millie. Didn't come from her. They owe us a lot of explanation for why these guys are wrong, but they don't interact with these guys. They don't say why they're wrong. It's just understood among them, because this is something that modern scholarship decided that they can't rely on. So they've got to start over as if this work was never done. The ancients never knew who wrote these things. We're never sure who wrote these things. They were sure. Now, they weren't sure about all of them, but the ones they weren't sure about didn't get in the New Testament. There's well over 100, maybe even considerably more, but at least 120 documents that have been identified that didn't get put in the New Testament because nobody was sure that they were authentic. In fact, they were pretty sure they weren't authentic. And so these modern people are asking us to believe that these ancient people either were incompetent and could not figure and didn't really know when they said so-and-so wrote, when they said Paul wrote 14 letters, they didn't really know that Paul wrote 14 letters. They were just incompetent to determine that. How can you say that? It's just very mundane. They would know who wrote the things. Now, when it gets to interpreting it, there's a lot of disagreement in how to interpret things, sure. But in terms of what letters they got, there's no reason that should be difficult. Or else they had prejudices, they had biases that caused them to say the wrong thing. Well, it seems to me that it's the modern guys that have got the bias. Because if a modern scholar starts saying, I've read the ancient writers and those that surveyed the ancient churches who had these texts, and they believe that there were 8 authors in total of the 27 documents. Paul wrote 14 letters, and there were 7 other authors. Let's see, that would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Peter, James, and Jude. That's who it was. If the person says that, they ain't going to get their contract renewed. And even if they've got tenure at a university and they start saying that, they're going to be laughed at by all their colleagues, because that position has been thrown out. The position that the New Testament was written by who we think it was has been declared a doctrine of rubes. Well, as I said last time, This is where I'm going to stand, because nobody knows the origin of Aunt Millie's recipe for German chocolate cake better than Aunt Millie's relatives.